We are live on YouTube, and I believe we have a quorum, so we could get started.
Thank you, Nicole. And I guess we do have the statement regarding virtual meetings was included in the packet. So I think that's covered. Will we next move to a roll call of attendance?
Yes, thank you. Let's start with Goochland County, Mr. Coleman.
Here.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas.
Here.
Henrico County, Ms. Meidler.
Here.
City of Richmond, Ms. Clark.
Here.
GRTC, and I believe Ms. Del Ross is with us and Ms. Torres is just coming in. I'll move on to DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky.
Here.
And for VDOT, I think Mr. Herman is with us today.
Yep.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance, and we do have a quorum.
Thank you, Nicole. Next, we do have consideration of amendments to the agenda. Does anyone have any amendments to propose? Seeing none, I will be looking for approval of the January 11th, 2021 meeting summary. Does anyone wish to recommend approval or have any discussion on that item?
This is Diana with the City of Richmond. Move for approval.
Sharon Smidler, second.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye or vote yes.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Consider that item approved. And Miles, may I turn the meeting over to you?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So thank you, everybody, for joining us again. I know the CBTA meeting just went long, so I'm sure a lot of you are exhausted already. Try and make this one quick. So first thing we have on the agenda today is the task 2 feedback. So this was the scoring and prioritization that we discussed last meeting. I really didn't receive much in the way of comments. I got comments back from Henrico, who's mostly seeking clarifications in a few areas and expressing support for a few others. I didn't receive any other comments. So based on the feedback we've received so far, the plan right now is to move forward with as presented with the RSTP CMAQ scoring adjusted to reflect the changes that were made at the LRTP Advisory Committee meeting in January. That's mostly adjusting the weights between some of the goals and the performance measures. And then we'll also be working with VDOT to develop that draft process for the cost and schedule review, as we discussed last meeting. Is there any other feedback on task 2 before we jump into the new material? Okay, so I'm not hearing any. So we'll go ahead and move on to the new material for today, which was the draft included in the agenda packet. So this is task 3, which is the project selection and allocations process. So we'll start with the RSTP CMAQ because that's the more substantial portion. So brief overview of the allocations. The approach that is included in the draft is the same approach that we presented to you last spring and summer. It's borrowed from Hampton Roads. So the goal of that approach is allocating essentially all 6 years at a time, rather than increasing the balance that we have like we do currently. It would basically set a baseline of 10%, and then over time that would be winnowed down as we address any cost overruns. So the order of allocations essentially would be 10% from the year 6 total to balance entry. The cost increase for any already programmed phases in years 1 to 5, the next phase of projects in year 6, and then new projects in order of priority based on available funding, and that would generally be in year 6. So that is the most significant change, as funding would be generally pushed out to the last year of the 6-year program for any new projects. So I've prepared a somewhat of an example just so we can walk through it. I think it's a little easier to visualize. So the colors basically are just phases. Orange is the PE, yellow is the right-of-way, green's construction. So there's 7 sample projects, and this is just a completely made up $3 million pot every year, just to make it easy math instead of taking real numbers. So if this is what we were starting with, everything that you see color coded would be pulled in from the last year. So this would just come straight off of the previous allocations plan. The first step would be to take 10% off the top and put it in balance entry for year 6. The next step would be to address any cost increases for existing phases that have already been selected and funded. The third step would be to move funds for year 6 towards projects that have the next phase. So in this case, construction for all of these projects. And it's split depending on, in this case, this sort of where a schedule would be. So, you know, if it's evenly 2 years, you could split it over 2 years. In the example D, maybe they only need a small amount in year 6 because it's really mostly in year 7. So that's kind of how that split works. And then the last step would be new projects. One thing to note, we did have additional balance entry left over in previous. This would be possible with our approach since we're not zeroing it all out in year 1 like we do currently. So anything that's left over previous that wasn't needed for immediate cost overruns in the current year could then go towards a study or other smaller type projects. And then the year 6 funds would be PE for anything new. So this is basically the overview. I've presented this to you before in TAC, and I think we had separate meetings to discuss this as well last spring. But open it up to any comments on the general allocation approach, any concerns, anything along those lines.
Miles, can you go back one slide?
Sure.
One more. Yeah. So, I'm seeing this and just kind of processing it all at one time. So one of the things really hasn't been an issue, but it was raised several years ago was the time limits on RSTP and CMAQ having to be, I'm sure I'm going to mess this up. It needed to be allocated within.
Yeah, it's obligated within a year of the allocation, right, and then expended within 3 years of obligation.
So on project B, you needed 100,000 because the right-of-way estimate went up. Would it make more sense to draw that money out of the previous balance entry as opposed to the year 3?
So the benefit, essentially, when we look at the allocations, only year 1 is really considered allocated. Everything else is essentially planned allocations. So in terms of when we look at it, it's really only the year 1 and previous that meet those timeline requirements. The out years don't matter as much. So this is just matching it up with the project schedule so that when we get to year 3, when that year 3 moves up and becomes year 1 in 2 more years, the balance, what's allocated here will match exactly the need. So then it'd be easy to obligate it all. So that's the thought process behind this. And it's basically, yeah, to answer your question, year 1 is the only one that really matters for those timelines.
Well, the previous, the 250 that's in the balance entry, it's been sitting there, not assigned to a project.
Correct.
So isn't the, and again, I haven't seen this applied, but isn't the time ticking on that money?
It is. So what we would do, and that's kind of the last step in here. So what we would do is use that for any projects that were in this last year, which would, I guess, be year 0 or year -1, however you want to look at it. Any of those projects that ran into issues, like let's say construction was starting and the bids came in high, that's what that's generally there to address. So our current approach, we leave it at 0 going into year 1, and we run into the issue where projects are starting construction and the costs increase at the last minute, and we don't have any balance left to deal with it. So the proposal here is to leave money in year 1, and then it becomes sort of that previous money so that we can address it. The other source of previous funds that you could see here would be a closeout. So let's say somebody had a project and their estimate was $1 million high. That money would go into the previous pot, and then we could reallocate it during the allocation cycle. So there's a couple different sources of where that could come from, but that's sort of why we would have a balance in previous, I guess.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you.
Any
Miles,
other
you
questions?
said that money, sorry. Miles, you said that money, the 230, could go towards a study or some other project. Will you have that list of projects in your back pocket somewhere so everyone knows what would be first in line for that if such money is available?
Sure. So what's in the draft right now, the draft basically says that for RSTP, it would be prioritized for studies. And then for CMAQ, it would be prioritized for TDM programs. The reason for that is if you just take 10% of the RSTP, that's about $2 million. So by the time it works its way through the process at $1 million, that's pretty close to what we normally see in studies. This year, we actually were really light on study applications, but usually we do see $1 million or so in study applications. So the thought was it would balance out pretty well, and we could put that for studies. And then for CMAQ, the TDM programs always need funding, and that's kind of an ongoing source. So this would be whatever's left over could be quickly applied to those projects rather than drawing on new funds.
Those studies would be studies that are already have been approved, but now the funding became available, so move them forward to take advantage of the funding.
So the way I think it would work in terms of the applications, I guess is kind of what you're getting at, is the study pot would be looking more at this previous and year one balance, whereas the other types of projects, multi-phase type projects would be looking at the year 6 and onward. So studies would be kind of pulling from a separate pot to allow them to have priority access because the studies are needed before you can really start the actual construction project. So we want to have that money available up front and then push year 6 for the actual PE right away construction multi-phase type project. So I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but basically you go through the same application you always do. We're just looking at different years for where we'd slot them in. So it wouldn't change anything on your end. On our end, we would just be saying it's a study. We want to look at this previous balance as opposed to looking at the year 6 balance.
Yeah, no, I just want to make sure that if we're pulling from any list of projects, out of transparency, everyone knows what those projects are, so that we're not just randomly bringing a project to the table.
Yeah, I think we would obviously prioritize just like we always do. So it'd go through a scoring process, and we discussed last month the scoring, the proposed scoring for studies. So the studies that come out of that in rank order would then be used to identify this previous. So big picture, it's not changing anything in terms of how it gets scored. Currently we do push the studies more up front and the other projects go a little farther back, and that's just because of the amount of money that's left over. The only difference is there might even be previous money that could be used for those now as opposed to year 1 through 6 funds. So.
And so just to elaborate on the studies, because I had questions about that too. This is Sharon. So it's a separate pot of money for the study. So let's say this year 1 of 3 million and out, these are truly the project pot of money. Is there's a separate section for studies or?
So I guess the best way to think about it is when it goes into year 6, we're setting aside 10%. So for like RSTP, which is where our studies would be funded, that's about $2 million. So as it works through those 5 years, as the project gets closer to actually starting, if there's no overruns, that 2 million pot just sits there. If there are overruns that we see for, right away or PE or something, and the cost increases, we'll draw down on that pot. But whatever's left over at the end of those 6 years is essentially a starting pot for studies. So if you want to look at the example that's on the screen right now, this 230 and the 200 and the 200,
okay.
If we don't draw those down anymore, that's what we start with for studies. Obviously with RSTP, we have a lot bigger numbers to work with. So I think there's going to be a lot more balance left over. But the benefit is this is giving us the flexibility to address those year one overruns for construction. And so we're trying to balance having money set aside for studies, but also being able to be flexible enough to address those overruns that always tend to show up last second. So.
Okay, and the studies, just so if any jurisdiction wants to submit the study, it's still a 6-year cycle. So they should submit.
No,
I guess,
so this,
okay, because
yeah,
that's
so
what I was
this-
worried about, because we know that doesn't happen because sometimes studies pop up every 2. Thank you.
Yeah, so the studies would be immediate. So if you submitted an application, like let's say this is what it looked like, and you submitted an application, the study would come from this 250,000 in previous money. So we'd be
Okay.
able to address the studies right away. If you wanted something that was a construction phase type project, that would go year 6. So if you had to go
Right.
through, a new bike ped project, that would start with year 6. So the studies right away, everything else really looking at year 6, I guess is the way to think of it.
Miles,
Okay,
I have
so-
a question. Oh, I'm sorry, Sharon, go
Go-
ahead. Finish your-
No, go ahead while we're on studies. I'll come back to the, go ahead, Darren.
Yeah, so on the studies question I had was, so if you look at this as a full 6 years, are studies only being accepted on year 1 of the 6 years and then no more, they're not going to be annually?
So no, so it would be annually for studies. So basically what it would be is whatever this earliest balance is would be used for studies in every single cycle. So the balance is going to change. It's not going to be the same pot available every single year. So essentially this is giving you guys an incentive not to overrun your budgets on your other projects, because that's taking away from your study money, is one way to look at it. But it's basically whatever we have that we weren't able to allocate onto a project in previous money is going to go to studies, because those can get started immediately. And then the need is immediate. So every single cycle we would do that. It's just that we're trying to fill in all 6 years rather than, the way we do it now is we've got, 20% left in year 4 and 30% in year 5, 40% left in year 6. So this is just trying to fill it all in, completed essentially. So we're not changing it as much in between year to year.
Thank you.
And the application cycle for RSTP CMAQ is still every year, but just the RSTP CMAQ funding is projected out further, except for studies, if there's no project overruns.
Exactly. So there's
Okay.
it's still, everything would run the same on the application side. It's just essentially you're treating year 6 as the year 1 for your projects now. So instead of asking you for an estimate in current dollars, we'd be asking for an estimate in whatever the year 6 dollars would be.
So I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. So every year we're doing 6-year increments, pretty much when it comes to the project.
So every year it would be the exact same as what we do now. The only difference is really the year 1 where you could actually get PE money for something new is whatever the year 6 of the 6-year program is. So that's really all that's changing. Basically what we're saying is the projects that we've already selected are in fact the regional priorities because we've already selected them. And rather than trying to move them around to slot new projects in earlier, we're keeping it stable from year to year and just adding on to the new year that's not already allocated.
So just give me an
Is it fair to
example
say-
in layman's terms. So next year, FY22,
Mhm.
if a person comes in with a project, this project is not going to be funded until FY27, 28.
Right. So 27 would be the first year that it would get funding. And obviously with this approach, there's going to be a transition year somewhere in here if we do move forward with this where we'd have to fill in the rest of the table because the way we have it allocated now doesn't match this approach. So at some point there would be a year where we have a lot of projects selected to fill in the rest of essentially to use up the rest of the extra balance entry.
Then I have one more question. So, okay, we apply in FY22 and then it's not eligible until 27, but that project then projects through 6 years to fully fund it. And so then the next, when we apply a FY23, it wouldn't be able to be funded until FY29.
So if it's already selected, you wouldn't have to apply for it again. But basically, but yes, so the point is that every cycle you'd be looking 6 years out. So it's more forward looking. It's more along the lines of how Smart Scale works, where the funding, when you're looking at Smart Scale, is several years out. You're not looking for funding for next year when you submit a project for Smart Scale. It's the same concept, and we're just trying to match it up with the fact that the new year that we have to allocate every cycle is not year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the year 6. That's the one that hasn't been allocated previously.
But then, and I know we hope that the transportation and the visions stay solidified through politics over, based on what the data says needs to occur. But that's a lot of time between applying and when it would even be a PE. That's just my comment.
No, I appreciate that. And that is something I think we've discussed last year as well, that this is obviously a change in approach. The reason we feel that it's beneficial, so this is essentially the approach that Hampton Roads is already taking, is that year 6 is the new year that you can apply for. But the benefit is this really matches up with how the 6-year program works. I mean, your allocations are already done for those first 5 years. So this is saying, well, we don't need to fiddle with all that again. Let's just focus on what's new. So alternatives we could explore would be not going all the way out to 6, go to year 4 or something along those lines. But 6 really matches the way that the allocation program as the whole functions. So any other comments on this piece? And I guess I should remind everyone, as we've done in the past, we're going to be open to emails on all of this afterwards, so we can put together all your comments before we prepare the final draft. So if it's not, if you haven't thought through all this and finalized your thoughts yet, it's okay. We have time to comment more on this too.
But Miles, is it sort of fair to say just that like year 1 is your actual funding allocation? Years 2, 3, 4, and 5 are updates. Those could be cost increases. Those could be a project that disappears because it found another funding source. And then what happened with year 6, year 6 will be your new projects. And so, for example, if a project disappears out of this plan because they found another funding source, that's going to free up potentially a project from year 6 to move forward more quickly if that opportunity presents itself.
Exactly. So if there's other funding, projects get canceled, projects need to get pushed back because they're not going to be able to obligate on time, to Joe's comment earlier, then we would be able to move things forward as needed. So we're still going to have the flexibility to do that. And we'll get on into the kind of how those pieces will work. But it's basically, yeah, you're spot on there, Tom.
And the expectation is that if you submit an application and you get approved, that is going to start out at year 6.
Exactly.
That new project.
Miles, go to the next slide. So, thank you. And like under this particular scenario, there may not, I just want to clarify for everybody, there may not be an opportunity to add a new project in year 6. We may need to take all of the available $3 million in this example to complete the funding on projects A through G. So I'd just be aware of that, Miles. Is that correct?
That is correct. So that was early on I think it was task 1. We talked about taxability to limit applications for a year. And the thought process was, if we get to something like this and we've essentially said, hey, we've already got funding committed for all these projects, there's no money left, we could skip it and just say we're only accepting study applications this year, to speed up the process, but also so everyone's not wasting their time.
Mr. Chair, if I would, Miles. So when we look at this and we think about equity, we're talking about projects, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I go back to 2019 as being too far. But, you know, where one locality, you know, received almost $12 million for a project. And in that same year, other localities received $1 million, the majority $1 million, with some others receiving $2.5 million, $4 million. So, and then I see for at least 5 years after that, those numbers for the one locality was still in about the $12 million mark. So how is that equitable across the region when that's occurring?
Yeah, I think the benefit of moving to this is we're going to try and move away from that focus on those year one, which is then creating that competition the same way. We are able to balance the new approach for scoring, as we went over last meeting and we talked about last week, Dorona, is that cost benefit analysis. So we are trying to move to something that's a little bit fairer to everyone, that if you're meeting the goals that we've adopted as a region and you're meeting those performance measures and your project is not terribly expensive, that it outweighs those benefits, you're going to get the funding. So we're trying to move to something that's a little bit more objective and data driven, that will help us to say, hey, this is fair because we know the outcomes that are coming from these projects. In terms of how the allocations have gone in the past, you know, we're operating on the guidelines that we have today. So that's part of the concern there, but.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, but with this, we're solidifying, you know, 40 million in those projects of funding in the next 5 years to that locality.
So in the grand scheme of it, you know, it's the funding between the different localities. I can give you guys the numbers again, but the breakdowns have been relatively even to population spread. And I can send that out again. I think we sent it out at the very beginning of the of this subcommittee, and we can pull those for you again. But that's something that we would have to look at as we lock this in. The other piece, as I mentioned, is there's a lot of money that's not allocated to projects yet. So if you look at the actual RSTP allocations, you have in year 2, 5% balance, year 3 is a 10% balance, year 4 is 20, year 5 is 30, and 6 is 30 some odd because we couldn't quite get to 40 last round. So there's a lot of money just sitting on the table right now. So at some point, if we did decide to make the switch, there would be a year where we would have to allocate all of that. And that would give us a chance to try and balance those numbers out over the 6-year plan as well, looking at population, looking at the projects proposed. So I think there would be a chance to look at that a little bit more equitably across the region too. If that was a concern, that's definitely something we could work with TAC on. So that is another piece of this. But in terms of things being locked in, once a project's selected by the TPO, it is locked in. I mean, we've essentially committed to funding that project at that point. Any other questions or concerns?
Well, I just share for Dorona, this was before your time. Golly, I can't remember now how far back it was, but the RSTP and CMAQ used to be allocated on a pro rata basis, based, I think, on population. And everybody loved that. I believe everybody loved that, because what it meant was it was kind of a reliable, guaranteed amount that each locality was going to get. And I think Hanover might have been 12.5%, and Rico and Chesterfield and Richmond were 18% and so forth. But the feds came in and said that didn't follow the planning process. And so we were forced to kind of migrate and continue to migrate to this objective ranking system that we all realize is an imperfect process. And there are a lot of things I don't like about it, but it's kind of been forced upon us for good or bad.
Yeah, to follow up on Joe's point, basically what the requirement is for the TIP is that the projects be selected through some sort of prioritization. And it specifically says in the federal code that it cannot be distributed to localities based on population or anything like that, or by mode. You can't just have a split by mode. So those are essentially out. We have to go through some sort of prioritization, which doesn't factor those in directly, which does obviously lead to those issues. We've tried to address that, but that's obviously doesn't seem like that's worked out as well as it could have.
Thank you. And if I could rather, it still was stated that the funds are being distributed fairly equal to the population set forth. So we're still figuring out a way, or you're still through the qualitative process, allocating the funds as you see fit, even with the guidelines that the federal government has given.
So there has still regional balance. That is something that's still considered. That's something that's always going to be part of the process because this is a regional organization. But we are trying to move with this new guidelines towards more of the data driven and making it more strictly if you're meeting the measures and your project shows benefit for the cost, that we are going to select it. So that's the intent of this whole update, is to move away from a lot of the qualitative pieces and move towards the data, so we can kind of make it a little less gray, a little less ambiguity, and more towards this is a benefit that we can see and we can demonstrate and we can quantify.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the allocations, concerns, anything else? And like I said, please submit written comments on all of this. We're taking everything into account as we prepare the put together final draft to bring to you, so we can go through it all in one document instead of piece by piece. So please submit all of your comments on this section. So to Joe's point earlier about funding potentially being over allocated for year 6, one of the other pieces that we're proposing, and we started implementing this on our end, is keeping track of our future commitments as well. So outside of the 6-year plan, we want to keep track of what phases will need funding for the projects that we've already selected. The goal is to make sure we're not oversubscribing and we're still leaving the adequate balance available for year 6. And it'll make it easy for us to estimate the funding for the projects in the next round. So if we already know more or less how much money is going to be needed in year 6 for the existing projects, we have a good sense of how much money is going to be available for new projects. So we can go to TAC, let you guys know, hey, we've got $4 million for new projects. So that gives you a sense of what's worth applying for at that phase. So here's an example of what that would look like. The same projects, we just keep track year 7, 8, 9, 10, just keeping track of what's needed for the next part of that project. Again, this is more just bookkeeping, making sure that we're not running into issues. This doesn't have any official bearing on the allocations, but it lets us have a very good sense of what the future allocation will be. So any questions on the future commitments piece? Okay. Now move on to the next piece. So this is one I think you guys will be interested in. It's the leveraging. So for Smart Scale, CVTA, obviously we've always encouraged leveraging with RSTP. We never really had a process defined for what that meant or how it would be implemented. So this is our proposal. So for the application, in general, what we would expect for leveraging is that the TPO would provide funds for the first phase of the project. So the PE phase. So whatever that costs, that would be what your application would be for. And you could use that to leverage against the overall project cost for Smart Scale or whatever other program you're competing in. And the cost benefit analysis that's done for scoring would be based on the request rather than the full cost. So it'd be based on just that PE cost, which will provide a benefit to applications for leveraging funds. If the project is selected for leveraging, it wouldn't be considered active, which would basically mean we're not going to put additional money onto that project. You can't come in and say, oh, I've got a cost increase for this project until it's actually fully funded. We don't want to keep throwing more money onto something that was just supposed to be PE and then have that come back and all of a sudden we funded the entire project. So the proposal in the draft is that you would be able to request one extension. So I think it's a little easier with the numbers. So let's say this new project selected in year 6 was just for PE and it's just for leveraging. So that you still have this 1.35 million in balance. We're not considering that a future commitment of the TPO because we're not intending to fund the full project. It's just for leveraging. But let's say we go through the next couple rounds of Smart Scale, and even with the leveraging, you're not able to get that project funded, and we get to year 5 here. You could request either to extend this out one time, where we would push it back to the end of the next cycle, which in this case would push it back to like year 10, I think. Or the alternative would be you could submit a new application for the full cost of and compete as a new project, essentially. So basically, we're giving you time to try and find money, but if you don't, you have to compete as the full cost of the project. So we're encouraging leveraging by scoring it only off of the PE cost originally. But if you're not able to actually do anything with that leveraging, then it's going to have to compete with the full cost. I know that's a little confusing. So if anyone has questions, I'm happy to try and answer those. Nope. Well, obviously my explanation was perfect, so we'll move on.
I guess it makes sense what you were saying, like the cost to benefit, like with the scoring Sulab was talking about in the previous meeting. If you just have the PE cost, it helps your ratio. I get what you're saying. That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. So that's good then. So any comments on this? If not, we'll move on and we'll accept those in writing too, obviously. So the next section would be cost increases. So this is where your cost overruns the allocations and you need additional funding. So just like currently, all of our active projects would be eligible for additional funding to cover those cost overruns. One of the differences that we're proposing is that you could lose your eligibility for the additional costs. And we'll get into those later on, but basically it's not updating the MPO when you need things changed on your project is essentially what it comes down to. And this is really more to encourage better communication both ways between us and the project sponsors, and also to try and make sure that we're not running any of those issues with not obligating funds on time. So in terms of how it would work, you would submit an application during the regular application window. The one exception we would make would be for bids that come in high. Since those are time sensitive, we would accept those outside of the normal application cycle. The scope changes would not be allowed as a reason to increase the cost. The reason for that being that the scope shouldn't be increasing and broadening. The project that was selected is the project that we want to fund. So that would not be a valid reason for why additional funding would be needed. Then just like normal, TAC can approve for the cost increase up to 10%. It has to go through the full TPO if it's more than 10%. And then the last piece is a bit of a change. It's that the percentage for the cost increase would be determined by phase, not by the whole project cost. And the reason for that is because of the way the allocations are set up in this, where we're looking at specific years for each phase. and here's the diagram to kind of explain it a little better. But basically, so this was 500,000, this one was 600,000. They each needed an additional 100,000. Since that's more than 10% of the original phase, it has to go through the TPO to get approval. Meanwhile, this one was 700 and it went up to 770. That's 10%. It only has to go to TAC. So the thought is, since we're really focusing on each year for the phases and it's more tightly bound to the years this way, the cost increases should also be a little more closely tied to the phase costs rather than the overall project. So any questions or comments on this? I know this is a pretty big change from the way we've looked at it in the past.
Hey, Miles, it's Tiffany.
Hey, Tiffany.
For the eligibility, if you rescind it, is it only for like the rest of the year or the current year? I'm sorry if I missed that. So
yeah,
if you take that, go ahead. Yeah.
So that was part of the discussion. So the concern obviously would be if the MPO completely revoked it, then the project would just flounder and not wind up funded. The proposal was that sponsor would have to find some other source of funding, whether it's their local dollars, CVTA funding, smart scale, whatever it takes to get the additional funding. But that's something we're definitely open to discussion on, because that's a complicated process. And the MPO is also required to advance projects when the CTV says it's time to advance an MPO selected project. So there's a lot of give and take on that. And I think we can discuss that. I think that's the next section. So anybody else have any comments on the increases? Okay, we'll move on and let you guys think on that one. So the next piece is swaps. This is the other piece. This is the first piece of how you could lose that eligibility, essentially. So as Joe mentioned earlier, the requirement is that funds are obligated within a year of allocation. So that means if we're giving you funding for PE in year one, then you should be obligating that PE phase by year two. And then you have to spend it within those next 3 years after that. So the goal with all of that, with the requirement and with us also following it, is to reduce our risk of rescission. If the funds are already obligated, they're not going away. So that's what we're trying to do with this whole process. So the sponsors can request the swap, and we mentioned this earlier, and it's basically to move back to your fund a year or two, whatever's needed, if your schedule is no longer on track with what was initially allocated. You would just submit a request and an application during the fall. VDOT and TPO staff would look to find another project that could move forward. And alternatively, the sponsors could bring the project. So if you have two county projects or two project in the city and a project in the county that are on similar schedules and could swap places, the two different sponsors could come, or the one sponsor that's got both projects could bring it to us. And then basically, just like every other transfer, anything else, you need agreement from the sponsors, VDOT and the TPO. So that's just basically making sure that everybody's staff is on board and agrees this is a good decision. If you don't request it, and this is kind of getting into the point that Tiffany just raised, this is where you could lose the eligibility for the overruns. And again, it's because we're creating that risk for the rescission now, and we're not following state law technically at that point. So what we're trying to do is discourage that by saying, hey, if you're missing that, we're not going to fund extra on this project. The other piece is if it's for PE and you're already missing and behind schedule, then maybe it's time to just deselect the project. And that would go to TAC and the TPO, obviously, to make the decision. So here's an example of what that could look like. So this is a nice clean example because I was making up the numbers, but let's say project B is behind and they know it's going to be behind and they're going to need to push back right away by a year. and construction by 2 years. And Project D is actually running ahead of schedule and they're able to advance. So if they submit to us that they need to move their project back, we'll work with VDOT, we'll put this together, move everything. So then basically you get the new schedule, and that would just happen with the next allocation plan. And then it looks like with this one in particular, we had a little extra balance that was left over, and that could be used to either fund new projects or to advance other projects like this Project F. We could put the extra 100,000 on Project F, and take it off of the future years that are out beyond the 6-year program. So this is a very simplified example, obviously, but this is essentially what we do already. Every single allocation cycle, we look at what projects want to move ahead, move forward, what projects are behind schedule or need to push back the funding, and VDOT helps us out and we make that work. So this is the same idea. The biggest difference here is instead of us working on it independently, we're requesting the application from you guys so that we know that there's a need to move the funding back. So any questions, comments on this section?
Hey, Miles, what's our current process about is checking in on statuses for projects that have been funded? So I know before they're usually like quarterly reviews with like VDOT and everything, but I just think that whatever we decide, it'd be important to know what opportunities there were outside of the localities or whoever receives the funds for the project to be able to initiate that conversation. I feel like the way that it's kind of presented now, it makes it the responsibility solely on the locality without, I know it's a little bit of extra hand-holding sometimes, but to have the opportunity to say that, we have checked in on you all, see where the projects have been. We've given you these notices about our concerns about the progress so far, and then that gives a little bit more foundation as to, not allowing them to apply for additional funds.
Sure. So, the current process is essentially Larry will give us an email and say, hey, here's a project that's running into schedule issues or budget issues. And then we start working it all out. That's kind of, since I started, that's kind of been the process that's was in place. So other than that, what we have is the annual meetings, every November, where we review all the current projects and then the new applications. So this is definitely a little bit more on the locality to request that. But I think there's a quarterly reporting proposal as well. So the idea is that they would go hand in hand, that we're talking regularly enough that we all know where the project is. So it shouldn't be a surprise when these applications come in. And I think that's kind of getting to your point, Tiffany, of finding a way to work together on that. So I don't know if maybe that'll address it or if we want to circle back at that section, but it was kind of a joint proposal of how that would all come together was our thought. Did anyone else have any comments or questions on the idea of the swaps?
Miles, this is Diana. I would echo what Tiffany said. I think that does provide some additional help for localities if there's consideration for a process that would be spelled out in regard to initiating discussion on project overrun and or I think it goes both ways. I think, hers was stated that here's the, fair process that we've gone about before we limit the funding. But I think that it also may be those notifications will get some people on track.
Okay. So I think what it kind of sounds like is maybe not the first time this happens, this is necessarily the problem, but we're having conversations regularly. And then if it happens more than once or something, and that's something that I'm open to comments on hearing how you guys think this should work. So if, obviously take more time, I'll send you this PowerPoint as well, so you can think through it. But if you have ideas on how we could implement that, the goal is not, we're not trying to punish anyone here. What we're just trying to do is encourage information sharing between the sponsors, VDOT, and us to make sure everyone's always on the same page. Because sometimes the information we get from the sponsor doesn't match the information we get from VDOT. And we're just trying to make sure everyone's records are all matching up and that we're making sure these projects are moving forward.
Thank you.
And this is the last slide that goes with the swap, but it's basically just showing that the future commitments would change as well, obviously to reflect the funding changes in the earlier 6 years. So this is a slide on surplus funds. Basically, this is not a lot of a change. The current program guidance currently says anything from before 2008 goes back to the locality. Anything that's FY08 and on comes back to the MPO to be reallocated to projects. And since we're now in FY22, the thought is the funds can just come back to the MPO. I mean, we're far enough out that there's not a lot sitting out there that's before the FY08 funding. So this would just continue what we're doing now, but just make a blanket, everything that's surplus comes back to the MPO. Once a project's either canceled or completed, it's obviously no longer active and we are not going to put any additional funding on it. So this is to prevent I don't think it's as much an issue anymore, but we have some UPCs that have been resurrected for different projects in the past. So this is, making sure that if a project is changed, it's going to be a new project and we're not just bringing back the old project. And then if a project is overfunded, and we kind of talked about this earlier, but like, let's say you went out and you were able to get funding from the CVTA and Smart Scale, and you got it through RSTP, and now the project's overfunded, we would try and take off as much of the RSTP as possible. With the Smart Scale, it gets complicated, it gets tied up. But the point is there's no reason to have extra money sitting on the project beyond the estimate. So it would still be active, which would mean that it could still receive additional funding if the cost did in fact increase. And it's still active all the way until cancellation or completion. The point is just we don't need to necessarily tie it up on that project anymore. So we still want to give them flexibility to come back as needed, but we don't want to tie up the allocations if we don't need to. So any thoughts, comments, concerns on this section? Okay. So then this is the last section for the RSTP CMAQ. So this is project tracking. So this is what we're proposing to get back to Tiffany's question earlier. What we're proposing is just quarterly reporting. So similar to what's already being done for TA, but just very high level, a quick update of, is the current cost and schedule the same as what we have? What phase are you currently authorized for? What's your next major milestone, and what obstacles or challenges are you encountering that might impact the cost or the schedule? The goal of this is not to take a lot of your time. The goal is really just so we can get updates a little bit more regularly. It'll help us to track the project development, and it'll also help to avoid those issues with swaps and overruns that we were just talking about. So this would make it clear that, oh, this project's actually starting to fall behind. So we could have those conversations of, next fall, you might want to put in an application to push back your right-of-way phase. So that was kind of our thought, was if we're reporting, we're all getting the same information. We can have those conversations earlier rather than, oh, well, we missed the application, it's too late now. And then the benefit of doing this and doing just a quick written report is that the fall meetings that we had in November, instead of focusing a lot on the current projects, would be primarily a presentation of your new applications. So it's your chance to give us more details. We talked about this briefly in task 1, but essentially it would be something more like a grant presentation. You get 10 minutes to come up, give us a little PowerPoint and show us what the project is, why is it needed, and what is it going to do, and how's that going to benefit. So the benefit there is we get a better understanding than one item in the 20 that we're already going through of your list of current projects. And I think it would give us a little bit more time to think of questions that might help or impact the scoring as well. So the scoring is going to be data driven, but if we don't understand the project well, it might not be as good of a score as it could have been. So that's the proposal with the reporting. And then on our end, we would develop the form that you'd fill out. It'd just be something online, something easy. If you miss the report, that's where we're thinking of the eligibility questions. So this is the same thing. We don't know how, this is kind of, is it once? Is it you miss it consecutively 3 times? That's the piece I'm very open to input on. But the idea is that if you're not checking in and updating us on the project, then it's harder for us to track. So we want some sort of accountability. So definitely open to comments and thoughts there. The other piece on here is that the TPO, our plan with all of this and where we're headed is that we would create a dashboard on our website where you can track all of our active projects. So all the TPO projects that are funded and currently open, you can see where they are, how they're progressing. Same idea as like VDOT's dashboard, but much more limited to what we're actually funding. And it would just help a little bit more to make it a little easier for the public to see our projects. So currently we put together the storybook each year after we select projects, and then we have our tracking tables. But this would just combine it all into one place, is the thought. So open to any comments, questions, anything on this section as well.
So Miles, a while back, you all created this RSTP and CMAQ allocations database, and which is a great tool. I'm a little bit unsure of how, if that, I have a link to it, I guess, but I'm not sure if I'm getting the most current information. Is that available on the website?
No, so that's the issue with that right now. So
Okay.
the data that comes from that, we upload as an Excel. And then obviously there's the PDF where Jen's been tracking everything for the past 30 years. So all those records are available too. So that's kind of got the more detailed version with the notes and the transfer, dates and everything in there as well. But the database, because of the access, we can't put that online, basically, is the problem. So that's what the idea behind this dashboard would be, is to make that essentially live and make that open to both you as the sponsors, but also to the public to be able to see the information.
So as far as that database goes, if I wanted, it's only going to be as current as the date that I receive it. So in other words, if I wanted something through this past month of January, I need to request that from staff for the update.
Sure, and I can have Greta send you a copy if you would like one.
I just wanted to understand. Like I said, I have one, and I know it doesn't change that often, but I just need to remind myself I need to do that when I want that information.
Yeah, and we have been trying to test it out, but we run into the problems of how to host it, and we tried going through SharePoint, but then so there's a lot of technical issues on trying to push out an access table, which is why we want to move more towards the online platform, essentially.
Okay.
So. Any other comments on the tracking proposal or?
Hey, Miles.
Yes.
For the high-level report, would that be something that the TPO would have generated as kind of a standard template for them just to fill in and submit to you all?
Yep.
Okay.
Probably just an online form to fill it out. And ideally, we'd like to integrate it with the data that we already have. So it's basically just update the cost if you need to. But otherwise, it would just be like a fillable form.
Okay.
Okay. Well, that was everything I had for RSTP CMAQ. And it's a lot, I know. So if you want to send comments, please email them to me. We'll take them through, I think the 19th. I have a future slide here that's got the date. Yeah, the 19th. So that puts us 2 weeks out again. So if you have any comments, please try and get them to me by the 19th. That way we can try and incorporate it into that final draft that we bring back to you. Obviously, that's our final draft. It's not necessarily what you guys have to move forward with next meeting, but we want to bring a completed, final, put together document that we can discuss the whole thing in one go. So this brings us to the last piece, which is the TA set aside. It's much shorter. It's one slide. So for TA, as we're trying to move TA into this overall set of guidelines, essentially the allocations cover 2 years. Our guidance is that we would want no balance in year 1 or previous. We can leave a balance in year 2 if we want, which the TPO has done in the past. And then projects should be funded in order of priority based on the rankings. And as we saw last month, the proposal is to use regional significance of the project and equity in addition to the statewide scoring process. And then the tracking and the reporting and everything, that's all handled through VDOT. So we're not really going to be as involved with these. So it doesn't take up as much space. So this is all pretty much what we've done in the past. So I don't think there's any real changes here. It's just we're writing it down somewhere. So any thoughts, comments, questions on TA? Okay. So next steps, submit any written comments by the 19th. And then our next meeting will be on March 8th, I believe, which is the next Monday that follows the same pattern. Yeah, so March 8th and at 3 o'clock again, and we'll send out the full draft with the agenda. So that would be the entire document, everything we've gone through over the past couple months. So you have a chance to review it. But that's everything I had for you today. So if there's no other questions or comments, I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Miles. As he said, the next meeting is March 8th. Are there any more comments for the good of the order? About 2 seconds. And we will consider the meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks.